So you were telling us about the South African coal-fired power station.
Yeah, I mean,
And yeah.
to finish the sentence, as long as South Africa and everyone else talks about renewables in South Africa as a theoretical proposition, then you can't expect any kind of values shift. On the other hand, if you make things happen on the ground, almost for any reason and in any way, then it shows people the difference. And I guess I'm of the belief, in responding to your question, values transformation comes through through example and behavior, not through sitting in an armchair and gaining collective insight.
I can see that. But, in that case, how come the big guns with the big money, like the World Bank and others, why aren't they putting the money, and the political leaders in South Africa, why aren't they putting the money into renewables, those 3.5 billions, instead of into the same old, when we all know the result of having more coal? I mean, coal is going to be such a crunch, isn't it? Isn't that the biggest bogey in this scenario? And isn't that why things are so difficult with China, for instance?
Well, I mean, there are several reasons. The World Bank is responding to huge pressure from South Africa and elsewhere, where they argue, your job at the World Bank is not to manage climate, but to promote development. And we need energy, and this is the only way we can get it, unless there is a different energy architecture internationally. And frankly, whilst obviously I'm not in favor of further coal development, at this stage of the global deal, President Zuma is right. That the work, for example, that I'm doing with the South African government, which is literally trying to invent a mechanism that enables a dramatic acceleration in investment in renewables in South Africa, clearly requires an international deal that currently is not on the table. So if Zuma is sitting there being told the lights go out mid-2011, then he's saying, give me an answer that doesn't depend on a deal that isn't being made. So, frankly, I understand the argument.
But isn't this a terrible vicious circle? It's a sort of chicken and egg. I mean, obviously the same thing, we heard in China, where there's, huge poverty and this huge amount of coal that's available there. How can we expect the Chinese government not to extract the coal, given the amount of poverty and the potential political unrest, if that resource isn't used? Nonetheless, isn't the whole point of this that we have to look beyond the immediate? And how is this tension going to be resolved?
Well, I mean, glass half empty, glass half full. Yeah. So glass half empty says South Africa is going to build a ginormous coal-fired power station that will make it even worse than it is today. And their carbon numbers are already absolutely awful. Glass half full says, with a relatively modest amount of money, South Africa could go to 15% of their total energy mix being renewables by 2020, but it requires political engagement in South Africa, which is increasingly there, and a modest amount of money from the international community. And I do mean modest. I don't mean out of proportion. China, glass half empty, glass half full, a new power station every 10 days, perhaps two, and all of the dirty industry stories that go along with that. Glass half full, 50 million vehicles by the end of last year. Yeah, how many are there in America? I think 5 at the last count, and they don't work terribly well. The most ambitious renewables targets anywhere on the planet. Some of the most stringent policies on automobile emissions anywhere on the planet, with implementation problems, admittedly. And so we are in a paradoxical situation where you can conclude that if we had the time, things would be okay.
Yeah, that's the crunch, isn't it?
But just before we dismiss that as a sentence, actually that's bad news. That's first of all good news, which is technological profiles, changing policies, interest of investors are all moving in the right direction. and some of the practice on the ground is as well, such as vehicle count, in China. Our dilemma is that our scientists tell us that the biosphere can't wait, and that the turning points on carbon emissions need to be much sooner than the current trajectories of change really suggest. So the good news, and I don't think one should always focus on bad news, the good news is actually the mainstream, slothful, slow, bureaucratic, politically inept, backward-looking markets, all of that stuff, and more and more green investment funds, more and more appropriate technology being used, sometimes going to scale, more effective public policies in key countries. There's good news to go too. The question is, how do we accelerate that? Yeah, and the key is not what are the 5,000 points of intervention, but what are the one or two major points of intervention that would make a significant difference.
And what do you feel those are?
Well, it feels to me that if the US economy is not going to mobilize its strengths, which is its incredibly entrepreneurial investment community and its ability to turn on a sixpence, if that's not an old analogy, when the right price incentives are in place. So the US economy can be incredibly dynamic if given the right incentives. And clearly at this point, both Copenhagen and its shortfalls and now the challenges to the EPA are all geared to trying to prevent the American economy from doing what it can do incredibly well, which is to move fast. Yeah, so that domestic agenda is absolutely key. Having said that, it does seem to me that when one takes a pretty cool look at what's happening in China, that the story is, as I said, quite extraordinary. That they, at current rates, are going to be leaders across many technologies, are going to be leaders in the production of renewables, are going to be leaders in reforestation domestically, are really going to push the boat out in terms of taking forward many of the agenda items that we want them to. And I think encouraging that, understanding the challenges and yet encouraging it, will encourage the Chinese to do what they can do best, which is not only the entrepreneurial side, but top-down, policy-driven, large-scale change, which is how we've had a lot of the changes in China over the past 5 to 10 years.